welcome to the Adversity Psychologist Podcast. I have my first guru on the show, so I have with me Anita Guru. Would you like to say hello? Tell us a little bit about who you are and what's brought you on today. Lovely to have you.
Thank you, Tara, and it's amazing to be here. As you mentioned, I'm Anita Guru. I'm the founder of the Mind Coach. I'm an experienced mindset coach, motivational speaker, and psychoeducator. And my overall mission is to really reach out to the people who might be struggling, can take something from my story, take something from the toolkit that I share, and really help themselves to feel better.
Do you know, that's what I loved when I knew that you were going to come on the show, is helping people to be empowered over their own well-being, that it's okay to share stories. I love people talking about lived experience. I think that connects us all. Sometimes there can be a little bit of shame or stigma, can't there, around sharing personal experiences, and just what that must bring to your work. And we're going to bring in hope as well, which is another wonderful thing for me. There's a huge scientific basis behind hope as well, which hopefully we can also bring in for people as well. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your story? And how did you get into this work? What is it about your lived experience that we can learn from?
So I think for me, the real turning point was actually November 2017, where I suppose, realised I'd hit rock bottom. So prior to that, I'd had a lot of traumatic experience from childhood, all the way through to adulthood. And I'd done therapy for a number of years on and off, so counselling. But I was at a point where nothing was helping me, and I knew that I needed more. And I did end up being hospitalised, and I was in and out of a psychiatric hospital for 2 years and diagnosed with complex PTSD. So that for me was probably, and it's actually next week is the anniversary to when I walked into that hospital. So that was the real turning point for me.
And what's really lovely is you're sharing your story with people. And is it all right to ask, when at that time, because obviously having a newer kind of diagnosis, trying to understand what that means, did you find that you had the right kind of support for you? Because not just kind of clinically, but also from those around you, in terms of you getting back to where you needed to be?
In terms of the clinical support, that was amazing. I was very, very lucky. And my husband's been phenomenal the whole way through and been a great support and sort of helping me on that journey. And I had friends and family around me, but I think at that time, I myself was carrying shame about what I was experiencing. So it was a shame about my illness, shame about how I was. And so I didn't really share. But in fact, if I did share, I didn't even share the extent of what I was experiencing.
And that's interesting in itself, isn't it? That, how much people don't share because of fear of how it might be received, as well, just in terms of not just in our personal relationships, but sometimes in terms of the work that we do. And what I really love as I've looked through my career is now people are starting to share, different mental health professionals also sharing their lived experience of anything, not just mental ill health, but that we are human beings and that we go through things and that we experience things. And I guess one of the things that you like to do in your work now is helping other people to be empowered over their well-being. And how do you do that? How do you help people take, because I know we are in a society where we like quick fixes. Sometimes we wait for things to go wrong before we intervene. How do you support people kind of take more of that preventative approach?
So I suppose for me there's a few avenues. So through the one-to-one coaching that I do, so I think it's being able to sit on the other side and hear someone's story, validate them, be a witness to their story and their experiences, which no one might have been up to that point. And also giving them and sharing tools to help them. And it's not just about me telling them what to do, but it's really imparting knowledge. And along the way, I also educate about what you might be experiencing and why. And that helped me a lot on my journey. And I think that's knowledge is power. And when you don't understand what's
absolutely.
happening with yourself, it kind of makes it feel worse.
Yeah.
So through coaching, it's really working alongside. And the way I describe it is we're in a car, they're in the driver's seat, I'm in the passenger, I have the map out and helping them which direction that they need to go in. So they have the power all the time. And I'm not the expert of their life, that they are.
Yeah. I like that, because sometimes there can be, if you're reaching out for help, this kind of power imbalance, can't there? And historically, when we kind of think back over the history of mental health services and psychiatry, this all-knowing kind of professional telling you or treating you even, using the kind of more loaded language. And I love the fact that we've moved away from that.
Yeah,
empowerment there.
And a lot of the time when someone's not feeling mentally well, it's the lack of power sometimes that they are experiencing. So to be able to give that back to them can be really groundbreaking.
Yeah.
And then, sorry, go on.
No, you go ahead. I'm fascinated.
Yeah. And then I suppose the other thing is through my workshop. So integrating psychoeducation. So I go into organizations and deliver workshops on all sorts of topics, from building mental resilience, understanding things like cognitive distortions, also known as mind traps, grief, and mental health awareness. So again, it's raising that level of education and knowledge, their self-awareness, and again, the tools for them to take away and start implementing for themselves or people around them. And then through sharing my story, and I've done that sessions in workplaces, I've done it in various media, people connect to stories and it helps them to feel seen.
They do. Yeah.
That they're not alone and there's hope. So this person is telling their story, they found their way through, and it gives them hope. And another thing that I've added or started last year was my route to becoming a therapist. So I'm halfway through. So that will be another thing and another avenue which I get the opportunity to connect with people on a deeper level and support them on their journey with mental well-being.
So you kind of got the two. Because for you, what is the difference? So if people are new to the idea of kind of coaching versus therapy, what is coaching to you? Because I think that's quite useful to help people understand.
Yeah. So coaching is a great analogy that was shared, actually, was coaching's about the future and therapy can be about the past. So, but it's not so defined in that way, because in coaching, of course, you have to refer to the past and to understand the present, but it's very much about taking actions, moving forward, whereas therapy will go deeper into things like emotions and processing, and there might be traumas there as well. So it's having that line and knowing that line of when do you need coaching and when do you need therapy. And for some, coaching was almost a little bit of a gateway into therapy. So there might be some fear. No, I don't want to have therapy. I'll try coaching.
Yes.
And through that experience and a good coach being able to say, signposting, actually, I feel you need something more.
Yeah. So it's really interesting that kind of, is there something around kind of stigma sometimes around therapy and coaching maybe being a way in, which I really like, if people do need something more, recognizing when that is. Because I'm just wondering, when we're trying to look at empowering people over their well-being, we can still be met with other people's misconceptions about mental health, well-being, seeking out support, even just preventative. Some people now want to do preventative work, but are kind of met with people kind of shaming or saying there's something wrong with you for doing that. And I'm just wondering how often that might then be a barrier to people reaching out or following through with work.
I think things have definitely changed, especially post-pandemic. People are open to getting support, and you can see that in the fact that therapists are inundated with requests. But I think there's still a fear element of going into therapy. What does that mean about me as a person, but also how much will I have to open up and be vulnerable? And that is difficult for a lot of people.
And how do you address that in your work? So if we have, because one of the things I love, there might be someone sat on a train listening to this, watching it on YouTube or wherever, kind of going, really thinking about reaching out, but how do you help people get over that barrier? Are there any little kind of tips that we could give people to help them?
I think it's give yourself permission to be vulnerable. You don't have to be at your best all the time.
Yeah, that's so freeing, isn't it?
Yeah, and you're human. We're so complex. Our brains and our minds are so complex.
Yeah.
So there are going to be times where things feel difficult and life will throw all sorts at you. And
it does, doesn't it, at times? And sometimes it can be in clusters or a single thing. You know, look at the pandemic and how we all navigated that. Cost of living crisis in the UK. And
it's daily, weekly, new things are surfacing. But the same way you need a personal trainer in the gym for your physical fitness, a therapist or even a particular kind of coach can help you with your mental fitness.
I really like that term, that kind of mental fitness. So, because that kind of comes back to that. Sometimes people we've all been guilty of it. I'm going on holiday, so therefore I'm going to do something about my body in the couple of months leading up to my holiday. But you might not be then thinking about your health, your well-being the rest of the time. And we can do the same with our emotional health as well, can't we? That we might wait until we're overwhelmed or even burnt out before we do something about it. But what are the benefits of doing preventative well-being work? What are the benefits of working on yourself and getting more of a baseline, do you think? Because I always think that's such an interesting question to ask.
I think something like, for example, I talk about in my session on building mental resilience is it's having those practices and routines in place so that they become a habit and they become natural. Because when you're not doing so well, it's hard to start something new and it's hard to tap into something you're not familiar with. So if you're, for example, daily walks, meditation, dancing, whatever it is that works for you, that helps boost your brain chemicals that make you feel good, that's the thing to tap into. And we can quite easily forget about those things that we don't prioritize ourselves as much, but it's really having those. And I kind of break it down into kind of 4 areas, which is your mind, movement, management, and meeting, which spans all the way across from how do you support your mind by doing certain practices, how do you manage your life, your work, your outside of work, what is there to support you with those elements. But then also meeting is all about connection, where humans are wired for connection. So how are you nurturing yourself with that aspect? And that's equally as important. And going back to the movement, it's making sure, like what I used to experience when I sat for long periods of time and I wasn't feeling good, just getting up and moving around can really shift your physiological and also your mind.
Yeah. And the things I always love is that sometimes we think we've got to be doing formal exercise. We have to be going to a class or a gym. Is that, yes, those things are great and we can do those things, but also thinking a little bit wider about what movement is. That, if you're on video calls all day with work, you're static because you're maybe flat and it's difficult to get motivated. Just going up and down stairs, as you say, walking around the living room, doing a few stretches, jumping jacks, tiny little things that for some people probably sound really silly, can make a huge difference. But also it can be that stepping stone to then trying something else. If you feel a little bit better, then maybe I can make some food for myself. Maybe I can have a shower. Maybe I can manage a small task at work, for example. And I think sometimes we overthink, or I personally do think we can overthink what mental health should be. I think we can overthink what we need to do. I must get to the gym. I must go on this hour-long walk rather than, do you know what? Can I just put my coat on and walk around the block and see what happens? As you say, habit formation, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think the pandemic taught us that you can do all this stuff at home. You have YouTube, which has millions of things that you can follow.
For
all
free
kinds of
as
exercise.
Well.
In your own home. And I find that I get my best ideas and thinking when I'm out on walking, because it's almost like your mind is free, you're out in the open, and it's like there's all sorts of processing going on, and that's the light bulbs come on.
And there is a big body of research actually that says that kind of rhythmic left, right of your feet causes kind of changes within the brain in a kind of a simple form that makes decision making more effective, but also processing our emotions more effectively as well. And it's free. Everyone can get out and have a little walk somewhere. We can walk around our house if we absolutely need to, or our apartment, whatever it is. And as you said, one of the things that I really like is when you're kind of thinking about connection as well, because I've been qualified a really long time. When I qualified, it was very much about doing strategies for your mental health, you know, breathing, grounding, but people didn't tend to kind of widen it out to kind of movement, connection in nature, and connection with people. And I love what you're saying there, you know, we are innately social beings. And what is it for you, the kind of meeting and the work you do, meeting others, connecting? What is it for you that makes that so good for our well-being? Because sometimes when we're overwhelmed, we just want to pull away from people, don't we, and things. And it can be hard to reach out and connect.
So last year, when I kind of left the corporate world and I went freelance, and I found pockets of communities where people are also, for example, freelancers, have their own businesses, and the level of support, empathy, compassion, sharing is huge. And it can be really lonely when you're out there trying to figure everything out yourself. And
it can be,
and it's just having someone who's done it or got a recommendation, or just someone who validates actually, I feel the same. It's huge. And I've got different communities on WhatsApp. So it's, there's always sharing, and it's that thing of, it makes you feel less alone, and it just helps you to do what it is that you're trying to do.
And I guess because I still do feel that there's a little bit of shame and stigma around this idea of loneliness. I still think there's a bit of a misunderstanding that loneliness is about being physically removed from other people, you know, being on your own. But you can live with someone, and there's different types of loneliness. Be lonely. You can have a really valued social circle, but be lonely at home. You can have, you know, loneliness in your job, but you've got wonderful friends, family, and a lot of people like myself, you know, practitioners who are individual, and we can get lonely in terms of how we connect with other people, and it can affect your well-being, can affect your mental health, can't it?
Yeah, and it's that saying of, you can be in a room full of people and still feel alone. And that was something that was really prominent when I was particularly unwell. And I think the way I describe it is a disconnect to myself, and so I couldn't connect to others, and I had a high level of dissociation, emotional numbing, all of those things. And I think those probably fed into that feeling of being so disconnected and by myself in that experience.
Is it all right to ask what helped you at that time? How did you kind of navigate your way through that?
So I think I was pretty deep in it at the time, and it's, I suppose, when I started getting the help to understand what I'm experiencing. So I suppose it's the education piece. So when I got the diagnosis of complex PTSD, so many things started to make sense. So it's less about having a label, but it was more about I now understand myself. I have the language around what I'm experiencing, what I'm feeling, and it's incredibly powerful to have that knowledge and understanding of yourself, because otherwise you just feel like you're losing it, you're judging yourself, you're feeling shame about how you're feeling, and it just really makes out all of those emotions feel a lot more intense. So I think it was starting to, and this is what I call my time of thawing. So I started to connect with the emotion. I started to feel it, experience it, even though it was incredibly overwhelming. And I suppose through that process, it led to me being more connected with myself, being able to connect with others. And over time, I started to share my story. And the more I shared my story and share my story, the less shame I feel. And I think that's been the learning for me, is by sharing, shame goes. And it's that saying of when you share in safe spaces, the shame goes.
Which is quite profound, isn't it? And what I love there, because sometimes people, so in the clinics that I run, psychoeducation is a huge part of what I do, but people don't tend to see it as an intervention as such. Sometimes people are waiting for the breathing exercise, the sheet on how to manage anxiety. But for me, the biggest intervention is helping people understand what's going on, because sometimes there can be fear associated with a situation where you don't understand, and anxiety and panic's a really good example of that, isn't it? That sometimes if people are having a panic attack but not understanding why their brain is responding to the threat or the perceived threat, why it is then that their body is then doing these certain things, that can make you feel worse. It can make you more stressed, and then you kind of get this vicious circle. And I can imagine for you, at that time, not knowing what's going on could be quite scary. It might be fear there, but also how able you are to tell people that I don't understand this, and what am I feeling, and how refreshing it must have been to then be able to go, right, this is trauma, this is what it does to the brain and the body, and to be able to notice that when it shows up in your everyday life as well.
Yeah, and it was, I mean, I'd seen a few different therapists. So up until 2017, I was probably seeing, I don't know, it was nearly 18 years on and off seeing different therapists. And I learned the difference between counselling and psychotherapy, which for me was transformational, because counselling, I feel like it's almost more surface level, dealing with things that are accessible, which, whereas psychotherapy, I went deeper and deeper into my past. And I feel through that process, I was able to process traumas and emotions and everything. But leading up to being hospitalized, I was experiencing incredibly horrific panic attacks. So in the middle of the night, waking up, and I was, the first time I thought I was having a heart attack, and it went on for probably about nearly an hour, and that started becoming more frequent. And I went to the doctors and they checked my heart, they did all sorts of that stuff, and then that was it.
Which is interesting in itself. Did anybody at that time suggest or know that they were panic attacks, or which?
No, they said I think they indicated that it might be some anxiety perhaps, but it was never followed up in terms of, okay, what do you need? So it just continued until I got to the point where I realized actually nothing else is helping me now.
Yeah. And the thing we know about panic and anxiety is then our brain's really good at going, this is going to happen again, this is what's going to happen, and how that adds to the intensity of symptoms. And just how many people listening to this may have been in a similar position, or how many other people may be like, this could be me. And then that's one of the reasons I love doing this podcast, is sometimes these organic conversations can lead to someone listening going, I have had that, or I'm having that, or my friend or my relative is having that. And I suppose being able to share this stuff with us, because for me that lived experience is what people will connect with.
And it's interesting now, because I'm through a few coaching schools, I've been running lectures on trauma-informed coaching, and it's interesting that coaches who are on the sessions are actually, light bulbs are going off for themselves about recognizing actually I'm experiencing this. So things like hypervigilance, as in
themselves rather than just the people they're working with. You can see, because sometimes there is that moment you can see somebody going, that's me, or has been me, or
so they're sharing that, oh my god, I'm now understanding what I'm experiencing. And there's I suppose the signs and symptoms of PTSD or trauma that people aren't aware of. So things like hypervigilance. So that's when you're constantly on alert, feeling like you're in danger, even though you're just walking down the street and nothing suggests that. And things like the dissociation. So I didn't realize
a lot of people might not know what that is, or even heard of that term before,
So it's basically it's like a psychological phenomenon where you might have experienced a traumatic event, and your brain kind of goes offline to protect you, and it's a survival mechanism. And literally you go offline, where you're not experiencing physical pain, mental pain, and in that time, and then it can become a technique that your brain does more often when there's perceived danger or actual danger. And I didn't realize that I was dissociating a lot until I was in hospital and realized and learned. And I still catch myself now. I'll be in scenarios where, again, there's nothing, there's no danger, but I'll find myself. And how it feels is my mind is going off into the clouds. And then I got to ground myself and bring myself back into the present. And be able to connect with my environment.
And as you're saying, it's having that understanding of the concepts, why the brain responds the way it does to the environment it's in, but then also, and that's the hard work, and it can take time to master that, is being able to catch it, or early warning signs. For some people, there might not be all the time, but, learning about what that can look like for you. I like to use that term that we might, even with dissociation, it might be a term, it might be something that's, rooted in science, but everyone will have an experience of it that's different. So your dissociative footprint might be very different from someone else's, and it's about learning and knowing how to manage it. And that's where, like you said before, power and knowledge, that if we're not understanding that's what's happening, how are we supposed to kind of lead value-laden lives? Because sometimes we might be living in fear. Some people then have really entrenched patterns of avoidance, don't they? I'm worried about panic attack, so I won't go out, or maybe I won't put myself forward for something that's a little bit new or scary in case something happens. And is it all right to ask you? You don't have to answer, but with everything that you've been through, what is it that's, because you do so much work, you just, just looking at a list of publications, you do a lot of media stuff, you've worked with some really huge companies, haven't you? What is it that enables you, because we've touched a little bit on resilience, to be able to get up each day and go and do this work? Even knowing that maybe a panic attack could come back one day, or that dissociation might show up today. Is it all right to ask that? Because I just find that incredible that you do what you do with the lived experience that you've had.
I think when I was hospitalized, I had about best part of 2 years out of life, I would say. And focused on my recovery. Had lots of major amounts of work on myself, because I was so adamant I want to get better. But I think now, for me, it's always been in my value base that I want to help other people, and I've been like that from a young age. And just being able to it's kind of me. It's so deeply ingrained and important to me that if I can connect with somebody else and help them on their journey to feel better, that's incredible, and that's, for me, purposeful. So
you get something from that as well, as seeing that change in
that. And when I think about or hear about people who are struggling, and there's something about people feeling lonely that hits me really deep. I want to do what I can, but also know, and sometimes I forget my limits. I'm not Superwoman.
That's interesting. So the kind of the level at which you need to look after yourself in order to be able to also then help and do the valued work with others. Be a hard balance, can't it? For those of us in kind of a well-being field, especially a lot of people in the well-being field also are kind of naturally, I think, people who want to help and give. Have quite a common value base, I think.
And I think a lot of people who, I suppose, not coming from lived experience and not telling their stories, can sometimes underestimate the impact of, for example, doing a talk and talking about my experiences. And that will leave people, how it can leave people. And there's been so many situations where I kind of done a webinar, and that the session ends and that's it. And you're left kind of to your own devices and with whatever might have come up. So I think it's also having that appreciation of when people tell their story, how big it is.
So almost that kind of, does it kind of almost taps into kind of duty of care? Are they all right? And that's for the people listening maybe, but also as a speaker, if you have lived experience as well. Yeah.
And you hear so often that, you know, speakers are approached, we can't pay you, but you're going to get exposure. And it's just like, no, that's not right. You're paying someone for their expertise and their everything that they bring.
That needs to change, doesn't it? And also, it's right to say, I find that a really cringy thing. Sometimes it's really hard to have those conversations and go, no, that's not okay, but we need to do it more. So I'm glad you brought that in now, because it's just, you know, if you're one of those people who invites people and says that, you need to rethink it. Or if you're someone who is a speaker, let's start having more conversations around that, because we need value people's lived experience. I still think, and this comes from a psychologist, so I'm a mental health profession, with certain qualifications, certain regulation, and yes, there are certain things I can do in my job, but I still think we're too heavily weighted on this kind of expert, all-knowing position. And I still think there's a power imbalance. I always say, like, when I go to my GP, I always find it really interesting that they're always in this big leather high up chair and I'm on like a school chair. Do you see what I mean? So just already there's a height difference, so it already kind of puts you in this mindset of this all-knowing. And of course they're a medical professional, but we should be discussing and collaboratively looking at whatever issue it is with both of our, that we are experts in our own bodies, how we feel, and then we're asking another expert to add to that. And I just think that's how it should be when anybody's looking at their wellness.
Definitely. And it's those power imbalances that can have the biggest impact. And I don't know if it's with age. The way I see it is I'm a bit blind to job titles, levels of seniority.
That's interesting. So in terms of the companies that you might have gone into over the years, or
I mean, I was a bit like, oh my God, they're senior and this, that, and the other. But in the last few years, that's kind of left me, and I'm thinking everyone's a human. We're all equal. You have your expertise, I have mine. You're no better than me. So there's not having that anxiety, I suppose, about talking to different people or talking to experts.
I'm so glad you brought that up. So is it all right? Obviously, won't name names and companies, but what is it you've noticed? So if you're coming in with your lived experience and you see a certain title, CEOs, those kind of titles still scare me, directors, what is it you've noticed that shows up?
When I see those titles?
Yeah.
Sorry, there's a really strange bird outside. I just noticed. Sorry, I got distracted.
I can edit that little bit out.
Yeah.
I have my 4-hour-old coffee. I just realised I didn't bring water up this morning. That kind of, what is it, if it's all right to ask, that shows up or has shown up when you've seen certain titles? Because I know for me, some of them can be quite loaded, and I can notice things showing up about how I want to respond to that.
I think that sometimes there is an initial, oh my God, they've done some phenomenal work. And I think I'd go to the more of a place of respect, and rather than anxiety about speaking to them. Because what I've come to notice is not everyone is what they project. So they might project or feel like, for example, a CEO has to have a face, a persona.
Yeah.
But everyone has insecurities. Everyone might experience elements of imposter syndrome. And not everyone knows everything. So everyone's going to have gaps in their knowledge, gaps in their experience. And everyone is so different and unique. So that's the way I
love that.
I suppose I see people, everyone as equals, and people might look at me and think, oh my God, she's got all these credentials, she's doing this, that, and the other. But I put value on it, but I don't let it define me.
Yeah. And I think there is something nice about the fact that we, taking the pressure off, we shouldn't know everything, but also isn't that what is wonderful about being human, that we can learn from each other. And you know, one of the things I'm always really, really honoured about, that people come on this podcast and share their stories, but I learn so much from every single person that comes on. And, you know, as a psychologist, I don't claim to know everything. I have huge gaps in my knowledge. And I think it's really good and healthy to be vulnerable and go, I didn't know that. I've learned this new term, learned this new thing. Because that's what makes us, I was thinking, as human beings, curious. That's what makes us ask questions. And I think we can then translate that back to our well-being. What's happening here? Why is my brain responding this way? I wonder what's happening when I'm around that person, that title. Why am I responding this way this morning? And that's how, hopefully, we then begin to make change, or that's how I see it.
Yeah, and you'll see that more, I suppose, for example, graduates or people early on in their career.
Yeah.
And in the workplace, there's this almost like perception that if someone's senior, you have to be a certain way. You can't talk to them like a normal human being. You have to be on guard. You can't share yourself.
So true. Yeah.
And that creates anxiety. And I think people are probably less likely to show up as their authentic selves. Yeah, and that's a real shame, because they're not bringing their actual selves, full self, to work.
And also, I'm just thinking the other side as well. What is it like for those CEOs? Do they get a bit lonely and isolated? No one ever talks about this stuff. You know, do they want people to tell them how their weekend was or how they're feeling today, or ask them, you know, how they're doing? Is it right to bring something else in before I forget, because I don't want to run out of time? But we're talking about grief before, and one of the things I know about your history is, you know, helping people to deal with their whole formulation. So we might have an experience of low mood, we may have an experience of panic attacks, but then at a different point in life, we may experience something like grief. So I know for you bring grief into work as well. Is that how you kind of help people to understand the different things they've been through and the interaction between those things? Because sometimes, you know, we might have a more complex mental health history, or we may have, or take me earlier this week, Kevin, you know, grief is showing up on top of what may also be my well-being baseline, and how that comes into your work.
So grief is an interesting one, and we're all going to experience it at some stage in our lives. It's something that is guaranteed. Loss is guaranteed.
We lose, right? Yeah.
And it's, from my own personal experiences, it's when I reflect back, is look at how it impacted me. Like, for example, in the workplace, I couldn't concentrate, I couldn't focus, I had brain fog, on top of all of the sadness and the emotions and everything else. And I think that, and people see grief as a moment in time. So someone passes, you have the funeral, you cry, and then life carries on. But no, that's actually the point where the grief will start kicking in, is when you go back to your normal life. Everyone else goes back to life and is not kind of huddled around you anymore. And you're left with the grief. And if you don't understand what grief can feel like, look like, impact you, again, it goes back to the judging yourself. Why am I not able to focus? Why can I not get this piece of work done? And that then all those negative thoughts, your inner critic can kick in. And in the workplace, I think if, for example, managers can understand how grief might be experienced and what might be helpful, what might be not so helpful.
I always love that question too, because sometimes we know what we don't want before we get to what we need and is helpful.
Yeah. And it's understanding that it's going to look differently for each person, and some losses are more complex than others. So it's treating everyone uniquely, but it's the empathy piece, I think, which can get lost. The empathy over sympathy, for example. It's the compassion. It's the emotional intelligence.
So I think some people use that word sympathy, but I'm not sure most people actually know or deconstruct that word these days. I loved what you said there as well, that there might be, if society kind of has these expectations around, right, at this stage of grief, you've had the funeral, you should be back at work now, or why are you still crying? Or we kind of have all these societal, and then we may have expectations for ourselves. I shouldn't be sad or crying, and grief can be, I found this week, very visceral, actually, feeling quite unwell, achy bones, flu-like symptoms. And my immediate thought this week is, oh no, I'm getting ill on top of this, rather than going, this is grief, and then that it's okay to navigate it the way that you need. So what I really love is that it's almost like I kind of see your work, it's like a layered approach, helping people to understand generally about well-being, so all the psychoeducation work you do, to be able to therefore recognize their own formulation, but also then what else life throws at us, because we may have a lived experience of mental health, so you may be starting from a different baseline, but then life throws us these things, and just trying to ask those questions. What is this? Because we might be grieving and think something's grief, but actually it might be our trauma from the past, or it may be something else that's happened, and just asking those questions, but in a really compassionate way. Is that right?
Yeah. And I think a couple of things that I learned was grief in your present life activates grief from the past, so it's almost like that will come back as well and resurface. But then also I found this incredible video a few years ago, which it had a picture, drawing showing what grief is like. So it's almost like when you have a loss, your grief is all consuming and it surrounds all aspects of your life, but that kind of decreases, and then sometimes it will increase. So it's almost like through the fluid waves, kind of, through the waves and cycles of life. So anniversaries, birthdays, Christmases, it might swell up and then it will go back down again. And it's I think having the outlets when it swells up is going to be important, whether that's you crying, you writing, you talking, meeting up with a loved one. Well, whatever it is, it's recognizing this is okay. I'll get through it and I'll be fine.
And that could be at any point, because sometimes those people, that's a really interesting point to get across to people, that, in those early days, people may be kind of around you, quite a powerful metaphor that, physically you're surrounded, but then, days, weeks, months, years, that grief shows up. I also like the pain button metaphor, that the grief may change over time, but when it shows up, it still hurts just as much. Is being able to reach out and saying what you need, because people do go about their lives. So, if we're really compassionate, sometimes we may need to be reaching out to people and saying, can we meet up? This is what I need. But also we can be asking questions, employers can be asking questions, family, friends as well. It's that kind of, what I really like from today is that kind of collaborative nature. We need to be maybe asking for what we need, recognizing what we need, learning, but also that those people in our lives in whatever capacity can also have a role in asking, checking in, and educating themselves maybe around.
And that's the thing. I think everyone benefits from learning about any aspect of life, because you don't know when it's going to land on your doorstep. So having that understanding again helps with the empathy, compassion piece for yourself, but also for others. And I know how hard it is to ask for help, because I've been there. And when you're in the midst of it, you feel like all the shoulds come in. I should be. But
that should critic is
it's powerful. But allowing yourself to be vulnerable to one person can make a big difference. Because otherwise it just sits in your head.
Finding that one person, that one little outlet. And sometimes what I find interesting as well, that person you think it might be isn't. Sometimes we find our people in unexpected places as well. We might think it has to be our spouse, our immediate family member or whatever. Sometimes you can just connect with someone and feel comfortable. It's about what's safe, really, isn't it?
And that might be a stranger.
Yeah.
And
a nice thing to take away, that just that not to overthink who, again, that could be a bit too rule bound. This is who I should be sharing with, or I quite like to be able to think outside the box sometimes of what that could look like, who it could end up being.
And when kind of through my recovery journey, I was in a lot of groups, a lot of therapy groups, and the power of group is something you can never describe. What you experience when you have witnesses to your story, people who feel the same, people who validate your experience. It's so many things that happen in that space, which can be so transformational for somebody.
I'm glad you said that. So as someone who's run groups, but I don't have lived experience of being in one as a user, is that sometimes there can be I don't want to be in a group, because there's many misconceptions, and I'm so glad that you said that, because actually it isn't just about, maybe you might go to a group because there's concepts you want to learn or a certain type of therapy approach, but it's so much more than that, isn't it? That being heard, being validating. Sometimes it's lovely to just, someone else goes, I know what that is like, I've been through it, to just have that. And sometimes it's almost unspoken stuff, you don't need to talk more, just to know, wow, you get me.
And I've run a support group on and off for about 8 years.
Wow.
But for me, when I qualify, the thing that I'm looking forward to is doing group therapy, because of my own experience. I want others to experience that. And it's incredible.
Wow. And what you can bring to that, because you'll have both hats, is actually really incredible, isn't it? I've learned so much. Your time has just flown by. I always say this to most guests. One podcast is not enough with the topics that we talk about. I could deconstruct so many of these things. So if you would like to come on again at some point, so we can delve into some of this stuff in more detail. People are going to want to find, how do we find you? Where do you hang out? Where can people find more about Anita?
So I'm on Instagram, LinkedIn are my kind of main social media platforms. But I have a website, so it's anitagurumindcoach.com. And Instagram, it's _the_mind_coach_. So
I'll
that's
make
where
sure
you can
this is all
find
in the
me.
show notes as well. And the show notes are live, so people just click on them and be taken.
Oh, perfect.
It's fantastic. So even before you think about anything else, click on those links, follow you, find out more about what you do. But also, I'm just thinking, how many people might be CEOs, the directors, people running businesses that need to just maybe have a little rethink about how they approach well-being, being vulnerable in doing that. I do ask everyone this: if you had a little adversity takeaway that you could give us, what would it be? I know we've had loads. There was a little nugget of something you can leave us with. What would it be?
So I think for me, the biggest thing was keeping hope. Keeping hope, because there was one significant day in my recovery that I was fighting my inner self to take my own life.
Right. Okay.
And there was this one part of me that said that just hold on, and this will pass.
Wow. Yeah.
So that would be my thing, is to hold on and find that voice that says, hold